I was elbow deep in a box of old tax files when my brother texted me that he and his wife had just signed paperwork to put our dad's house in their name. He didn't ask, he didn't call. He just sent one message, FYI, took care of the house situation. Dad agreed. Like he was letting me know he'd picked up the dry cleaning. I read it 3 times. Then I set my phone face down on the kitchen table and finished sorting the files, because that's what I do when something is wrong. I get very, very still and I work. My name is Faye. I'm a paralegal and I spent the better part of 8 years helping other people untangle the legal messes their families made. I know what a deed transfer looks like. I know what Dad agreed can mean when the person doing the agreeing is 71 years old, has moderate cognitive decline, and hasn't been fully himself since my mother died 14 months ago. My brother's name is Scott. He's 4 years older than me and has always operated on the assumption that being the oldest also means being the most right. Growing up, that mostly meant he got the front seat and the last slice of pizza. As adults, it started to mean something more dangerous. He developed a habit of making decisions for the whole family and presenting them as already done, the way you announce you've already ordered at a restaurant before anyone else has looked at the menu. His wife, Renata, is the sharper edge of that particular blade. She's not unpleasant exactly. She's the kind of person who says the right things in the right tone while meaning something else entirely. After my mom's funeral, she told me it was so good that my dad had Scott nearby to help with the big decisions. I smiled and said nothing. I've learned to save my words for when they count. The house is in Clover Hill, a suburb about 40 minutes outside of Columbus. It's not worth a fortune, maybe $260,000 on a good market day, but it's the house my parents bought when Scott was 2 and I wasn't born yet. My mom planted the garden out back. My dad built the porch railing himself, crooked in 3 places because he always said measuring twice was for people with more patience than him. It is not just a house. It is the only place I have ever gone back to that still felt exactly like before. My dad, after my mom died, got quieter in a way I didn't have a word for at first. It wasn't depression exactly. It was more like someone had turned down the volume on him. He still laughed at his shows, still burned his toast every morning, still called me every Sunday. But there were gaps. He'd start a sentence and lose the thread. He'd ask me if I'd heard from my mom, then catch himself, then look out the window for a long time. His doctor called it grief-related cognitive changes and said it might stabilize. She also said he was in a period of heightened vulnerability, and that major financial or legal decisions should ideally involve someone he trusted outside of his immediate household. I printed that part of the visit summary and kept it. I don't know why exactly. Instinct, maybe. The same instinct that made me, 6 months after my mom died, ask a family law attorney. I work with what the process would be if someone wanted to contest a deed transfer. She walked me through it in about 10 minutes. I took notes. Scott and Renata live 20 minutes from my dad's house. I live in Cincinnati, 2 hours away, which I know they count against me. I visit every 3 weeks and call every few days, but in their version of events, proximity equals dedication, and dedication equals authority. They had started referring to themselves as my dad's primary support, which is technically accurate, and also, in their mouths, a territorial marker. The week before the text, I had driven up to see my dad. He was having a decent day. Made coffee without forgetting the carafe, remembered that I'd recently switched jobs, asked about my cat by name. We sat on that crooked porch in the early October cold, and he told me that Scott had been coming by a lot, that it was nice to have help, that Scott and Renata had been talking about some paperwork stuff, but he wasn't sure what exactly. "What kind of paperwork?" I asked. "Oh, he said, and trailed off toward the yard. I didn't push it. I should have pushed it. 3 days later, the text. I put my phone down, finished the tax files, made dinner, washed the dishes. Then I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and looked up the Franklin County Recorder's Office property database. The transfer was there, filed 2 days ago. My father's name removed, Scott and Renata's names added, deed type, warranty deed, gift designation. Gift. My father had gifted them his only major asset, the house he and my mother bought together, the house I grew up in, while in a documented period of cognitive vulnerability 2 weeks after a doctor specifically recommended against major financial decisions. I closed the laptop. I opened it again. I looked at the document for a long time. Then I called my attorney contact. She answered on the second ring. I want to be honest about what that conversation felt like. It felt like standing at the edge of something I couldn't walk back from. Because I knew, once I made that call, once I said the words out loud, it became real in a way that couldn't be undone. Scott is my brother. He came to every one of my school plays. He taught me to drive in an empty parking lot on a Sunday morning and never once raised his voice. There is a version of the person he is that I love. This wasn't that version. But that version still existed somewhere inside the history of us, and I knew that what I was about to do would change everything. I made the call anyway. She told me that what I was describing, a deed transfer of this nature, executed with someone in a documented state of cognitive decline, potentially without full informed consent, could constitute undue influence and, in some circumstances, financial elder abuse. She said the first thing I needed to do was get an updated cognitive assessment of my dad, ideally through his own physician, without Scott or Renata present. She said the second thing I needed to do was not tell Scott what I was doing. Can you handle that? She asked, keeping this quiet while you gather information? Yes, I said. She knew me well enough to believe me. The next 4 weeks were the hardest kind of work, the invisible kind, where you're doing everything and no one can see it. I drove up to Columbus on a Tuesday and took my dad to his regular checkup, something I'd started doing since my mom passed. Scott usually came to these appointments, but I called the office in advance and told them I would be bringing him this time. The receptionist noted it without comment. The doctor was warm with my dad, unhurried. Afterward, when my dad was in the restroom, I pulled her aside and explained the situation in about 90 seconds. The deed transfer, the timing, the prior visit notes about vulnerability. I asked if she could document her current assessment clearly, specifically with regard to his capacity for major financial decisions. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, I was going to call Scott about this anyway. I'm glad you're here. The assessment she wrote noted moderate short-term memory impairment, difficulty with sequential processing, and, this is the part that mattered, likely reduced capacity to fully understand and consent to complex legal transactions. Not incompetent. Not absent. But compromised in exactly the ways that matter when someone puts a deed in front of you and tells you to sign. I kept a copy. The next week, I called the attorney my parents had used for their will and estate documents, a woman named Ms. Hargrove who had known my parents for almost 20 years. I told her what happened. The silence on her end lasted long enough that I started to think the call had dropped. Scott contacted me about 3 months ago, she finally said. He asked about transferring the house. I told him that given your father's condition, I wouldn't draft those documents, and I strongly advised against proceeding. He never called back. She paused. So they went somewhere else. A notary, it turned out. Just a notary, no attorney. Quick, easy, no one asking hard questions about what Dad actually understood when he signed. Ms. Hargrove agreed to review the transfer documents and provide a written opinion on whether proper process had been followed. She didn't charge me for that review. She said it wasn't about the fee. Meanwhile, I kept calling my dad every few days, the same as always. I kept visiting every 3 weeks. I brought him soup once when he had a cold. I helped him replace his smoke detector battery. I sat on that crooked porch and listened to him talk about my mom, The garden, the early years, a trip they took to Gatlinburg in 1989 that he's told me about 40 times and that I would never in my life tell him I've already heard. Scott texted me twice during this period, once to ask if I was coming up for Thanksgiving, and once to forward a photo of my dad with their kids, captioned, "He's doing great." I responded to both with normal, pleasant messages. I didn't mention the house. I didn't ask questions. I didn't let anything in my tone shift even slightly. Because if he knew I knew, and knew what I was building, he would start covering his tracks. And I needed the tracks exactly where they were. There's a particular kind of patience that feels like swallowing glass. You stay calm on the outside while something is happening on the inside that you can't describe to anyone who hasn't felt it. I had felt it before, in smaller ways, waiting for a settlement to come through, waiting for test results, waiting for someone to show you who they are. This was the largest version of that feeling I had ever navigated, and I navigated it by working, by being methodical, by thinking about my dad on that porch with his cold coffee and his crooked railing, and deciding that the feelings could wait. Miss Hargrove submitted her written opinion 6 weeks after I called her. It was 12 pages. The summary was clear. The transfer had been executed without adequate legal counsel during a period of documented diminished capacity, and there were significant questions about whether my father had understood what he was signing or had been subject to undue influence. She recommended the transfer be challenged and provided the statutory citations to support it. I filed for an emergency guardianship hearing 2 days after I received her opinion. I also, that same day, finally responded properly to Scott's original text. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I wrote, "Hey, I wanted to let you know I've had a chance to review the deed transfer on Dad's house with an attorney. There are some concerns about the process and about Dad's capacity at the time of signing. I'm going to be in court next Thursday for a guardianship hearing. I thought you should know before the paperwork reached you officially. If you'd like to talk before then, I'm available." I sent it and set my phone down. He called 6 minutes later. I didn't answer. He called again. Then Renata called. Then my dad's number appeared on my screen, which meant one of them was there with him, calling from his phone, which told me everything I needed to know about how they handled the news. I let it go to voicemail. Then I texted my dad's number directly. "Hi, Dad, I'm working right now. I'll call you Sunday like always. Love you." He texted back a thumbs up. I don't know if he knew what was happening. I hope he didn't. I hope he was sitting in his chair watching TV with no idea that the people he trusted had just started to realize the water was rising. The guardianship hearing was not a dramatic courtroom moment. It was a conference room, a judge, 2 attorneys, and a lot of paperwork. Scott and Renata had hired a lawyer by then, a fast one, sharp suit, the kind of attorney you call when you need to move quickly. He argued that the transfer had been voluntary, that my father was of sound mind, that I was attempting to insert myself into a caregiving situation I had largely avoided. That last part landed like he intended it to. The judge looked at me. My attorney presented the medical records, the prior doctor's recommendations, Ms. Hargrove's opinion, and a timeline of the transfer process that showed it had been executed within 11 days of the doctor visit where cognitive vulnerability was specifically documented. She also noted that Scott had previously consulted an estate attorney who declined to facilitate the transfer and that he had subsequently found a notary-only solution. The judge looked at Scott. The silence was not long, but it was complete. She issued a temporary order suspending the deed transfer pending full review and appointed a neutral third-party guardian ad litem to assess my father's capacity and the circumstances of the signing. She also noted that the timeline raised, in her words, significant concerns. Scott didn't look at me when we filed out. Renata did. I couldn't read her expression exactly, but it wasn't the one she usually wore. It was smaller. The full review took another 8 weeks. I'm going to skip most of those weeks because they were a specific kind of exhausting that I don't have good words for, and because what matters is what came at the end. The Guardian ad litem's report concluded that my father had not fully understood the nature of what he was signing, that the transfer had been facilitated in a way that took advantage of his vulnerability, and that it should be voided. The court agreed. The deed was reversed. My father's name went back on his house. Scott and I have not spoken since the hearing. He sent me one email 2 months after the ruling that was 2 paragraphs long. The first paragraph said he had done what he thought was best for the family. The second paragraph said I had destroyed any chance of a real relationship between us. I read it twice, then filed it in a folder on my desktop labeled Reference, which is what I label things I need to keep but don't need to feel. I don't know what happens next with him. I've stopped trying to write that story in advance. What I know is this. Last month, I drove up to Clover Hill on a Saturday, and my dad and I raked the leaves in the backyard, the ones that fall from the big oak my mom always said she was going to have cut down but never did. He remembered the name of my cat. He told me the Gatlinburg story again. We ordered pizza and watched a game show where neither of us knew any of the answers, and he laughed so hard at one point that he had to set down his slice. Before I left, I walked around to the back porch. The railing is still crooked in the same 3 places. My dad built it with his own hands in 1987, measuring wrong and not caring. Because some things you build for yourself and the people you love, and those things don't have to be perfect to be worth keeping. I stood there for a minute in the dark, my hand on the uneven wood, thinking about all the things we protect without anyone ever knowing how much work it takes. Then I went back inside because my dad had found another game show and was calling my name. I keep thinking about that crooked porch railing. 3 uneven spots, same as always because my dad built it by feel instead of measurement and never once apologized for it. That railing has been wrong for almost 40 years, and it is still standing. There's something in that I'm still turning over. People ask me sometimes, not often, but sometimes, whether I regret how things went with my brother. Whether I wish I had handled it differently, said something sooner, found some softer path through it, and I understand why they ask. Scott is not a villain out of a movie. He is a person I grew up with. Someone I have history with that goes back further than my own memory. The answer I give is honest. I don't regret protecting my dad. I do grieve the version of my brother I thought I knew. What I've come to understand is that what happened wasn't random. Every step in that story followed from a choice. Scott chose to consult an attorney who told him no and then find someone who wouldn't ask questions. He chose to move quickly, during a window when my dad was most vulnerable, because he understood on some level that slower would mean scrutiny. Those weren't accidents, they were decisions, and decisions have weight. They go somewhere. The court didn't rule against him because of bad luck. It ruled against him because the record of his choices was sitting right there in 12 pages of documentation and a timeline that couldn't be argued away. I think about what it took on my end too. Not to congratulate myself, I want to be clear about that. But because I think the honest version of this story includes the fact that protecting someone you love requires more than love. It required me to stay quiet for weeks when everything in me wanted to confront my brother directly. It required me to understand the legal process well enough to know which steps came in which order, who to call first, what documentation would matter and what wouldn't. It required me to sit across from my dad on that porch making normal conversation while I was simultaneously building a legal case in the background. That kind of steadiness isn't something you're born with. It's something you have to choose, over and over, when it would be so much easier to just react. There's a version of me who makes that first call emotional and loud, who texts Scott back with accusations, who lets the urgency override the strategy. That version of me loses, not because she's wrong about what happened, she's right, but because righteous anger without precision is just noise, and noise doesn't reverse a deed transfer. What actually works, I've found, is the combination of knowing what's right and being willing to do the slow, unglamorous work of proving it. Integrity isn't just a feeling, it's a practice. It shows up in the paperwork you keep, the appointments you attend, the calls you make at 7 in the evening to an attorney who answers on the second ring because she trusts that you wouldn't be calling without good reason. My dad doesn't fully understand what happened. He knows there was some kind of legal situation with the house, knows things are settled now, knows I was involved. One Sunday, he said to me, out of nowhere, "You always did pay attention." Then he went back to his show. I didn't say anything. I just stayed on the couch next to him where I was always going to be. The railing is still crooked, the house is still his. Some things, if you hold on to them carefully enough, stay exactly where they belong.